Hello, and welcome back to the Ron Talks Tabletop Podcast. Today, I have another guest on here from the RPG community to talk about his project and things going on in his life. So, guest, would you like to introduce yourself? Who are you?
Of course. I'm Jason Terry. I'm a co-founder of Antidote Games, also a dad, a software engineer, a gamer, and occasionally a race car driver.
Well, don't get ahead of yourself, man. I got a question to talk about that kind of stuff.
Okay.
All right. So, Jason, thank you for coming on to my podcast. You have a project of interest to me and a game of interest to me. So, I'm definitely excited to hear a little bit more about it.
Of course.
But first, so that folks can get to know who you are a little bit more, this is a tabletop podcast. So, we're going to be talking about tabletop gaming. So, Jason, how long have you been into tabletop gaming and how did you get your start?
And it's always hard to put a date on it, but I do know that it has to be about 15 to 16 years ago. My start was also kind of a super slow burn. So I didn't have a lot of access to like friends or people that were into the hobby at all.
Okay.
Right. But I had one friend who would kind of come to my town when they stayed with their dad on the weekends. And they were much more, they were located closer to the city. Right. And they would come and talk to me about playing Warlord and painting miniatures and going to like their local game store. And I was just enamored. And I spent many of hours at my local library looking at the Reaper mini forums, just hearing
Okay.
people like reading people talking about like 3.5 and D&D and, tabletop role-playing games, specifically ones miniature adjacent, because I really just loved the terrain pieces and painting and all that too. But it was like at least a year and a half to 2 years before I ever even got to remotely play anything. It was just a lot of crawling forums.
Interesting. Whereabouts did you live at that time?
In Mechanicsburg, Ohio, which isn't like
Okay.
terribly far from the city, but it doesn't really have unless you want pizza, it's not a really great place to be.
Got it. Is that in the Cleveland area, metro
It's
area?
West
Columbus?
Central, yeah, west
West
of
Central.
Columbus, yeah.
I thought I recognized that town name. Okay. Yeah. So I can see that. Being not too far away from Columbus, Columbus has a hopping game scene. Uh,
It does if you're in Columbus. This as a
right.
kid, like when I'm 13 years old, you can't. I couldn't get my parents to like commute me in to the places where I could enjoy those things. The 2 years after that, it was 2007. A friend of mine that I used to know wanted me to go to OhioCon with him. It was my first ever anime convention. Back then, they also had a gaming room for tabletop role playing games as well. I was over the moon about that. I went and I played Call of Cthulhu. That was just a phenomenal experience. I remember the GM doing a great job. We were investigating some swamp and we were in like a boat in the swamp, like a canoe. I was a veteran soldier of World War One or something like that. I don't even remember the details, but I do remember getting pulled under the swamp by some tentacle monster and then dying abruptly. I played Heroes. I think it was like fourth edition or third edition. I don't even remember. That was pretty fun. And then I got to play 3.5 towards the end of the last evening of OhioCon, which was a whole adventure in and of itself. And ever since then, it's like it's been a main occupant of my brainstem. It doesn't leave.
I was about to say that's 2007. That was the tail end of 3.5. I
Yeah.
remember it finally. Those were interesting times, man.
I feel like that was like the height of hacking systems, right? Because as 3.5 dwindled, we got Exalted before it was a real thing. We got a bunch of spin-off or hacked systems related to different shows. IRC chat was really big. So we had a lot of community spin up to create RPGs just to play at IRC chat. And an era that was like mostly before VTTs, there was a couple of tools you could use to still do that,
Oh
like
yeah.
Open RPG and map
Open.
tools.
Yep.
And I spent an embarrassingly unhealthy amount of time in Open RPG hacking systems. That which is like I would say like my I've been designing games long before tabletop RPGs came into my life. Open RPG was the gateway to what real game design was for me.
Interesting. Open RPG and IRC chat gaming was really your gateway into the hobby in earnest.
Because I didn't have like a local group. I didn't have
Right.
that kind of circle.
That's interesting to me because, obviously the direction that Hasbro is going, there's a big digital push, which, that's their prerogative. And obviously there are people that are in your situation right now.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be really interesting to see how things develop with them and with other role-playing games. So cool. I think you're the first person that I've actually interviewed that's had that experience as their formative RPG experience. Do you have a in-person play group now, or you got an in-person play experience?
Oh yes.
You host it yet?
I've after using every VTT under the sun, and I've done in-person play many times over before, but never like long term, right?
Right,
Like
yeah.
I would spin up groups while I was in the Marine Corps abruptly. Basically, I would teach everyone willing to learn how to play everywhere I went. And it didn't matter what game it was. Like if I had a game I was interested in, I would just be like, let me teach you this. Let's play. It'll be fun. Luckily now I have a room dedicated to this, and I have my table, and my wife is a huge gamer now as well. I've converted her wholly over to tabletop RPGs from things like Agricola and other board games. And I have like neighbors too, like my neighbor, and I live in the country now. So I'm very far from Columbus. I'm very fortunate that my neighbors next door also into tabletop RPGs, and they craft terrain and they run their own D&D 5th edition campaign. And so I've kind of been very fortunate to maintain a community despite being so removed from the city still. But I appreciate that community so much more after being stuck in the VTTs for so long. I really don't want to go back to VTTs if possible. After COVID, I was like, nope, we're doing in-person games only. I got my group together and I haven't broken that promise yet.
It's funny that you say that because right now, the only consistent game campaign I have right now is an online game with two of my dad buddies.
Sometimes that's all you
Um,
can do, right?
yep, yeah. What brought you to Shadowdark? What do you like about it? And that kind of stuff.
So it was Runehammer's video that gave me the surefire. I need to check this out. So Runehammer posted their video, praising the Shadowdark. It's the next big thing, best thing since sliced bread. I was like, all right, it's worth checking out. And we had a road trip to somewhere. Me and the wife did with the kids. And one thing we like to do on road trips is talk shop and pick apart different games out on Kickstarter, because we were doing a lot of market research at the time for what would now become Antidote Games. And we were downloaded the Shadowdark Quick Start on this road trip, and I just had her read it to me in the passenger seat while I was driving. And she read through it once, and I was like, nah, this isn't going to work. Like, who would do this? How are you going to get people to buy into this? It's going to be such a mess. And then we stopped reading it for a bit. And then about 40 or 50 miles went by, and I thought about it a lot. And then I was like, can you read that section on the torch timer again? And that's when it hit me. Like, Shadowdark was solving adventure writing design problems with its mechanics. I was like, never again will I have to write an adventure and then after the fact figure out why it's time critical. Like, never again will I have to write another adventure and think about like, what is their motivation for being here? I just need to put treasure there, and then the motivation and narrative, like the players make that up, and now there's a reason to be there at the end of the day, no matter what. And I was like, this is it. This is what I want to teach people now. We went, started playing it, and then we had made plans to go to GaryCon, which conveniently enough was like right up after that, I think, a little bit after that, like checking out the quick play. And we got to meet some people there. I met Kelsey there. She ran some games for us. And I was just blown away. I was like, this is exactly what I thought. It's like the perfect RPG, very, very teachable. That was what very important to me. It had to be teachable. Can I teach this to people that don't want to play RPGs and have them enjoy themselves, right? And it did all of those things and more. So that was how I got into Shadowdark and why I became such a like evangelist for the book.
It's certainly one of my favorites. And I started gaming a long time ago, like
Mm-hmm.
back when the what's considered now old school style of gaming was the style of fantasy gaming. I mean, it's such a great blending of that philosophy plus modern mechanical sensibilities because I just played an AD&D game at GaryCon this year, and in first edition, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I do not miss all of the subsystems. I know why they're there. I know that those guys were basically designing on the fly. No one made a role-playing game before them, but Shadowdark took the spirit of what they had and streamlined it. That's what I love about it. I mean, amongst other things. if you're listening to this podcast and you have never tried Shadowdark, as I said in my last Shadowdark video, go check it out. Really, you won't regret it. But Jason also brought you on, actually mainly brought you on here to talk about some things that you're doing here in the community, like about your company and everything like that. I know you have a Kickstarter that is ongoing that, your company is doing. So let's talk about your company a little bit. What is Antidote Games all about?
It's always an interesting question to answer because what we're doing is making cool things for Shadowdark with the Shadowdark community. So it's easy for us to accidentally seem like that's really what we're about. But Antidote Games, the vision and the kind of like mission at Antidote Games, what I'm trying to build with my wife, is a publisher that's flipping the narrative of how we interact with creators, right? So my experience as a game designer over the year has not been super encouraging. Every time I've tried to take the hobby and make it a business, it's not gone well. And when the further I would get, the more obstacles I would face, right? And this is me as a young kid too, not just as an adult actually trying to make it. And the one obstacle that I always thought was problematic was this mindset, and this was before the era of Kickstarter, mind you, this mindset that once your game is done, you have to get a publisher to like it enough to want to publish it, right? My belief is that if a game designer is passionate enough and they actually have the design chops, their game is probably marketable. But most publishers, they want the game designers to take most of the brunt of the investment. Sometimes that works out really great, but for the most part, the actual people creating these things, their names and their recognition gets lost in the process. My belief is that if the writers and editors and artists and stuff are going to pour into these things to build them, like we should know who they are. So that was kind of like the first thought that I had to start this. And then the second thought was, why even wait till the game's done to interact with these creators? So my wife works in the credit union industry, and I've been in software engineering for about 6 or 7 years now, and almost all of that has been in banking. To start a small business, it is tremendously difficult to get capital from a bank or a financial institution unless your small business involves real estate, some sort of physical collateral, or is what's it called, a service-based industry. You're starting a publishing company, it's very difficult to get capital up front unless you're willing to put up your house or have savings. So investing in creators that don't have the capital to say like pay that extra $4,000 worth of art that their product needs to be like professional and polished, that layout person to make sure their thing is laid out really well. We want to find people with those ideas early, invest in their product early, like right away, help them get to the finish line and then recoup that investment at the finish line while they keep their creative rights, control of their product, really at the end of the day, helping them build their individuality and their brand. Antidote Games is trying to become a publisher that's creator first and kind of building out a network of resources for creators to tap into. That's like the belief. Actually getting to the point to where we can do that, that's where we're at now with unlocking the industry, learning the pitfalls of the physical products, figuring out how to run these Kickstarters in a manageable way that doesn't say to you, hey, here's how you run a blockbuster Kickstarter, have a YouTube following. That's what Antidote Games is. We're a creator-first publisher whose focus is helping creators as early as possible achieve their goals and building their brands and identities so they can stand tall in this industry. And then while doing that, creating the blueprint for what a profitable studio looks like.
Let's talk about your first big product here. Is it Larillian? It's on Kickstarter right now, and it is doing well. It's funded. You're doing something right, Jason. So, but tell us about Larillian. Tell us about the project, the setting, and everything.
Larillian is the big mega city in all fantasy. The whole supplement really is like, how can we put adventure in the city when they could just leave the adventure and rest? And the first problem we solved is like, we'll just add a simple paragraph that says, what happens when they leave? Design your dungeons. And like Kelsey does this really well, right? She designs her dungeons in a way where the random encounters kind of support the ecology of the dungeon. So you have this feeling that when you roll on the table, it's not things just popping into existence, it's things moving around.
Yes.
So we lean heavily into that. And then the third and final thing with Larillian, the lion in particular, was like, what is the discourse or strife in the world? Like, is this a dark fantasy setting? And if so, what does that mean? Why does that statement even matter? There are no good guys in this world, period. Like every time you think you found the good guy, they have something that makes you go like, I shouldn't be on their side.
Honestly, this sounds not to simplify your setting, but this is for me reminiscent of Lankmar. I'm liking the sound of this.
Another thing I was concerned about was like, how do I do something for this community that shows them I'm not just someone trying to make another one-page document, trying to follow the zine trend.
Right.
I don't know if this came from DCC or where it came from, but this, and it's not that I disagree with it. I don't hate it. I wish we could go back to the day where you go to your local bookstore and there's a new book for your game that you play and you could pick it up and go home and read it. And the way the book is structured, just to tell people, is we kind of segment the book into three parts. There's the lore, right, which is kind of front loading you and priming you on what this world is. Then we have like gameplay advice, right? And this is how to run your game, how to use bounties and warrants, how to quickly come up with factions and utilize them well, how to maintain, how to very quickly track faction reputation with the party, right? What do you do when the party's looting and pillaging? Like, how do you throw them into prison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last half is the adventures and the dungeons, right? Well, the first half, that lore section, it's all presented as if it was in the world, right? That book is a book in the world. On Larillian is a book in the world. So everything you're reading is by some author in the world that your character probably picked up and read at some point, which means you as the character now know all of this. So it's not like a thought of like when you're reading a campaign setting from D&D and it's like, well, would my character know about these elves over here? Or would my character know about this city? Or no, your character probably does know this if you want them to. And that's kind of like phase one, right? That's the start of a very, very delicate balancing act that we've been figuring out. And this is why it's been such a difficult thing to create and collaborate on, because the way we're doing it is like the antithesis of lazy writing. So once we lay that foundation and give you all this information about the lore, the factions, the regions, what kind of monsters you'll find here, what kind of interesting sites are here, what political parties might be up to, what are the rumors, how do people get paid, right? Like what kind of work could you find, different kinds of downtime activities, etc. Then we prop into the adventures, and all the adventures are written from 2, maybe 3 defining principles. One is that adventure needs to stand completely on its own. There should be no sequencing adventure to adventure. So second to that, 4 big narratives occurring in the city. And I could tell everybody what it is, not that big of spoilers. One, that there's rumors of a nefarious cult to an unnamed god operating in the city. What they're up to, what they're doing, why they're doing it, that's to be determined. The other rumor in the city is that there's the harbor has been blockaded. No trade in or out of the city, which is kind of like a big deal, seeing as Larillian itself is like the trade hub for the entire known world, right? That's why it's such a crazy profitable city, is because it's been the center of all trade in and out the world over. The third big rumor is that there are a massive amount of arsons going on in the Sprawl. The Sprawl is like the slum district of the city, and it makes up like almost 1/3, if not a bit more, of the city. And then what was the final rumor? The king on his deathbed is the final rumor. So the king of Larillian is decrepit, old, and dying, and all of the heirs to the royal throne that can be elected, because it's like the Senate of Larillian will vote on which of the heirs they think will be the best next king, right? And that's how it works. That's their system. And when the king passes, they'll have to elect a new heir. Well, if all the heirs are dead, then there's no election, and the Congress or the Senate or the noble council takes control. And so those are the 4 big rumors that's going on in the city, the things that are happening. And we trickle all of those bits into every one of the adventures in some way without it being a sequence. It's just kind of left to your players to go like, oh, he's one of the noble heirs. What do we do with this guy now? And then as you as the good GM, you're going to say, what do you want to do with him? We want to give you the tools you need to create a really good one to tell us about. So far, that writing style has worked really well, because it means that these adventures work really well together, but they also work really well when I take them to conventions. The most exciting thing that I have is I want to see like someone's report on like their first time running through the campaign. Like what interested them? What did they do? How did they use it? And that's kind of like the rough outline of what Larillian the Lion is. And it's the first in a trilogy, because we're going to do 3 of these big books. And this first one is just like the blueprint, right? Essentially.
Yeah. So I was going to ask the question. So what's next in line? So
immediately next will be Cursed Cathedral by Jordan Rudd. I'm hoping it could be a Larillian adventure, but I don't know. It's so good on its own. We've been working very hard. Jordan is kind of allowing us to test out. Where I talked about Antidote is like, if you're the person who's has something really great and you've done the indie thing, but now you need the blueprint for how you take that to the next level and get it printed and published and out there and physically in people's hands. Jordan's like given us the luxury of like using his great work to test our methodologies to do that. And I am super excited to share what he and Jerry have put together because it is a phenomenal adventure. Jerry Honeywell, they did most, if not all, of the art for Curse Cathedral, and it's going to be an amazing, amazing product. Second to that will be another Larillian product called Larillian Insert Title. We don't really have a name for it yet, but what I can say is it's an Appalachia themed, cryptid, kind of injected mountain wilderness crawl. And the goal is to kind of embody the dynamics of Appalachia and like the how different families on different mountains kind of like have different levels of wealth. It's really all laid out. All of this ecosystem that we've had for the lore is laid out so that we can present a different campaign structure. Whereas Larillian is the urban city crawl campaign, which is very much point crawl at the end of the day. With the Appalachia one, we're trying to say that the adventure is the journey. So there's a lot of points to go to carouse, to interact, to whatever. And then the mountains themselves and the caverns in them and the other things of that nature, that's the adventure that's occurring, right? So how do you run a campaign where the adventure is the journey from place A to place B? And that's kind of a trend, right? Larillian is showing you how to run Shadowdark in this kind of campaign. Yes. And then the next one is showcasing how to do it in this kind of campaign. And then the third and final one will be another kind of campaign. That's the like the subtle art of, again, emboldening that Shadowdark is the greatest game ever made. Because we made 3 books that show you how to run it in 3 different kind of campaigns, all in the same world. It's a bit of a massive undertaking, but again, it's all about showing the community our overwhelming commitment to this thing that we love, so they don't confuse us with folks who are just trying to cash in. Because the other things that I want to make are board games, like very badly.
There's certainly nothing wrong with that. Of course, that's also a crowded space.
It is. But it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah. Seems like you are well on your way to success with your first project, and so it looks like you have some pretty good momentums here. So it sounds like you have a lot of things in the works, which is cool. I'm sure you have stuff that's in the works that isn't quite ready to talk about yet.
Yeah, we got some things cooking. There is definitely some. We're juggling plates. That's what we're doing right now.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll have you on some point in time in the future to talk about those things. Well, Jason, I have one last question that I like to ask all the people that come on my podcast. So, Jason, what is one interesting thing about you that people may not know about?
Oh, man, that is a good question. So I lived in Japan for a short time while I was with the Marine Corps. I was with a MWSS of 171 in Iwakuni, which is on mainland Japan. It's about 40 minutes by train west of Hiroshima. It's on the southwestern shores of Japan. And while I was there, I also became a rave DJ, as weird as that sounds. So I took up DJing as like a second job while I was in the Marine Corps in Japan, which is just a weird statement to say. Even to say it out loud, it sounds like you're making it up. It's like, oh, I lived in Japan for a bit and was a rave DJ. Like, is just a bizarre statement. And no one ever knows that, because if you were to see me on the street, you would look at me and think, oh, yeah, rave DJ. I look so removed from that. And it was just a phenomenal experience. It kept me from developing crippling alcoholism, being a rave DJ, because the Marine Corps can be a rough time. So very glad I discovered that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, sure, folks in the Marines like to party as well, but it is kind of a funny, it's an interesting visual, considering how clean cut and proper that of an appearance you have to have, being in the Marine Corps and then doing that. Thank you, Jason, for coming on our podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully I'll have you on at some point in time in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ron. I mean, you took a chance on me, hoping it was an interesting talk, and I appreciate that. Like, I appreciate the time and just the ability to talk about what I'm doing. I don't get to do that enough, so thank you.
Where can people find you, Jason?
Other than someplace in Ohio, the best place to find us is on the Antidote Games Discord. Or you could find us going to antidote.games, just antidote.games. No .com, antidote.games. And then there's a link right there where you can join our Discord. Otherwise, just look up Larillian the Lion. You'll find our Kickstarter. You can check us out through that and engage. Come ask us, drill us.
Thanks, folks, for listening to the Ron Talks Tabletop Podcast. And until next time, See you later.